Marcus Henderson had been sitting in that same plastic chair for 3 hours, watching the second hand of the wall clock tick past 2:47 p.m. The antiseptic smell of Mercy General Hospital had long since burned itself into his nostrils, mixing with the stale coffee from the vending machine he'd been nursing since noon. His weathered hands, still bearing the calluses from 23 years in the Navy, gripped a crumpled appointment slip that read, Admiral Richardson, 3 p.m., room 314. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus didn't know was that in 17 minutes, Admiral Richardson would make a decision that would unravel a secret buried for 32 years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus shifted in his chair, the cheap vinyl squeaking under his weight. Around him, the cardiac wing's waiting room buzzed with the quiet desperation that hospitals seemed to breed. A woman in scrubs hurried past, her shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. An elderly man dozed in the corner, his oxygen tank hissing softly beside him. Marcus checked his watch again, 2:51 p.m. His appointment with Admiral Richardson had been scheduled months in advance, requiring him to drive 14 hours from his small apartment in Tucson to this sterile medical complex in San Diego. The letter had arrived on Navy letterhead, formal and brief. Mandatory medical consultation regarding service-related injury claim. Failure to appear will result in automatic denial of benefits. He'd served under Richardson during the Gulf War, back when Richardson was just a captain commanding the USS Fitzgerald. Marcus had been a petty officer then, young and eager, believing that following orders was the same thing as doing right. Now, at 54, with a bad back and hands that shook when he tried to write, he understood the difference. The appointment slip grew damper in his palm as he remembered the last time he'd seen Richardson face to face. It was aboard the Fitzgerald, 3 days before they docked in Norfolk after their final deployment. Richardson had called him into his quarters, poured 2 glasses of bourbon despite Navy regulations, and told him something that had haunted Marcus for over 3 decades. What happened in Sector 7 stays in Sector 7, Richardson had said, his eyes hard as steel. For the good of the ship? For the good of the Navy, for the good of your future, Petty Officer Henderson, do we understand each other? Marcus had nodded, too young and too scared to do anything else. He'd taken Richardson's money, signed Richardson's papers, and buried the truth so deep he almost convinced himself it had never happened. Almost. The cardiac wing was an odd place for their meeting, Marcus thought. Richardson's assistant had been specific about the location when she'd called to confirm. Room 314, Cardiac Observation Unit. The Admiral will see you at 3 p.m. sharp. Marcus had assumed it was just another sterile conference room, the kind the military preferred for official business. A nurse emerged from the elevator bank, her badge reading Jennifer Walsh, RN. She moved with the efficient purpose of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that reminded Marcus of his drill instructor's wife. She glanced at the waiting area, her eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before continuing toward the nurse's station. Marcus had prepared for this meeting for weeks. He'd gathered documents, medical records, photographs he'd kept hidden in a safety deposit box for 32 years. Evidence of what had really happened during those final days aboard the Fitzgerald. Evidence of why his back would never heal properly, why his hands trembled, why he woke up screaming some nights with the taste of salt water and diesel fuel in his mouth. The VA had denied his disability claim 3 times. Each rejection letter cited insufficient evidence of service-related injury and lack of corroborating documentation. What they really meant was that the official record showed nothing. Richardson had made sure of that. But Marcus had learned things over the years. He'd kept in touch with other sailors from the Fitzgerald, and slowly, carefully, some of them had started talking. Tommy Reeves, the machinist's mate, had finally admitted what he'd seen in the engine room that night. Sarah Chen, the communications officer who'd been transferred immediately after they docked, had sent him copies of radio logs that were supposed to have been destroyed. Even Father Miguel Santos, the chaplain who'd administered last rites to 3 sailors in the medical bay, had broken his silence before his own death last year. The truth was coming together, piece by piece, and Richardson knew it. Marcus watched the elevator doors open and close, each time wondering if Richardson would emerge. He looked up recent photos of the Admiral online. Richardson was 63 now, his hair silver instead of black, his face lined but still carrying that same arrogant confidence that had defined him as a young officer. He'd risen through the ranks exactly as he'd planned, his record unblemished, his reputation sterling. At 2:58 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Delayed 15 minutes. Wait for me. R. Marcus stared at the message, something cold settling in his stomach. In all his years of military service, he'd never known Richardson to be late for anything. The man ran his life like a naval operation, precise and calculated down to the minute. At 3:07 p.m., another message, medical emergency, rescheduling, do not leave the hospital. The coldness in Marcus's stomach spread to his chest. He looked around the waiting room with new eyes, noticing things he'd missed before. The nurse with the gray hair was still at the station, but she kept glancing toward the cardiac observation rooms. A security guard had positioned himself near the elevator bank, casual but alert. The elderly man with the oxygen tank was awake now, and his eyes were too sharp, too focused for someone who'd been genuinely sleeping. Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the same unknown number. Henderson. Richardson's voice was exactly as Marcus remembered it. Clipped, authoritative, with that slight Boston accent he'd never quite shaken. Admiral, Marcus replied, his own voice steadier than he'd expected. There's been a change of plans. I'm not coming down to see you. Sir? You're coming up to see me. Room 847, cardiac ICU. And Henderson? Richardson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Come alone. What we need to discuss. It's not for official ears. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, his mind racing. Room 847 wasn't a conference room or an office. It was a patient room. Richardson wasn't here for a meeting. He was here as a patient. Marcus stood slowly, his bad back protesting after 3 hours in the plastic chair. The security guard by the elevator didn't move, but Marcus felt his eyes tracking his movement. The nurse with the gray hair looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. As Marcus walked toward the elevator, he realized that everything he'd assumed about this meeting had been wrong. Richardson hadn't summoned him here to intimidate him or buy his silence again. The Admiral was dying, and whatever secret they'd buried 32 years ago was about to surface in ways Marcus had never imagined. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As Marcus stepped inside and pressed the button for the 8th floor, he wondered if he was walking into a confession or a trap. With Richardson, it had always been impossible to tell the difference. The 8th floor of Mercy General felt different from the cardiac wing below. The lighting was dimmer, more subdued, and the constant beeping of monitors created a symphony of electronic heartbeats that seemed to echo off the pale green walls. Marcus stepped out of the elevator and immediately noticed the increased security presence. 2 guards flanked the nurse's station, their positions carefully chosen to monitor both elevator banks and the main corridor. Room 847 was at the far end of the hall, past a maze of equipment carts and IV poles that seemed strategically placed to obscure the view from the elevator. As Marcus walked the corridor, he passed open doorways revealing glimpses of other patients. An elderly woman connected to a dialysis machine, a middle-aged man whose chest rose and fell with mechanical precision thanks to a ventilator, a young mother holding vigil beside a child's bed. But it was the closed doors that caught his attention. Room 843 had 2 men in dark suits standing outside, their earpieces barely visible beneath carefully styled hair. Room 851 was guarded by a single woman who looked more like a federal agent than hospital staff. Whatever was happening on this floor went far beyond routine cardiac care. Marcus paused outside room 847, his hand hovering over the door handle. Through the small window he could see the back of a hospital bed and the silhouette of monitoring equipment, but Richardson himself remained out of sight. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "No visitors except by appointment," in block letters that reminded Marcus of Richardson's own handwriting. He knocked twice, softly. "Enter." Richardson's voice was weaker than it had been on the phone, but still carried that unmistakable authority. Marcus pushed open the door and stepped into a private room that looked more like a command center than a cardiac care unit. 3 large monitors displayed not medical information, but what appeared to be encrypted communications feeds. A secure phone sat on the bedside table next to Richardson's personal effects, and a laptop computer remained open despite the hospital's usual restrictions on electronic devices. Admiral Richardson sat propped up in the hospital bed, wearing standard-issue pajamas but somehow managing to make them look like a uniform. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite his circumstances, and his gray eyes held the same calculating intelligence that Marcus remembered from 32 years ago. An IV line snaked from his left arm to a bag of clear fluid, and cardiac monitoring leads disappeared beneath his gown, but he seemed alert and focused. "Close the door, Henderson. Lock it." Marcus did as instructed, noting that the door had been retrofitted with a deadbolt that definitely wasn't standard hospital equipment. When he turned back, Richardson was studying him with the same analytical gaze he'd once used to evaluate enemy positions. "You look older," Richardson said without preamble. "So do you, sir, though I didn't expect to find you in a cardiac ICU. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Richardson's laugh was dry and humorless. "Massive myocardial infarction 3 days ago. Right in the middle of a classified briefing at the Pentagon. The irony wasn't lost on me." He gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Sit down. We have a lot to discuss and not much time to do it." Marcus remained standing. "About my disability claim?" "Your disability claim is the least of our problems right now." Richardson reached for a manila folder on his bedside table, his movements careful and deliberated. "Tell me, Henderson, what do you know about Operation Clean Sweep?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Operation Clean Sweep was the classified designation for their final mission aboard the USS Fitzgerald, the one that had resulted in 3 dead sailors and a cover-up that had buried the truth for 3 decades. He'd never heard anyone speak the name aloud except Richardson himself, and that had been in a locked cabin with no witnesses. "I know what you told me to know," Marcus replied carefully. "Equipment malfunction, tragic accident, no one at fault." "That's what I told you to say. That's not what I asked." Richardson opened the folder and pulled out a series of black and white photographs that Marcus recognized immediately. They showed the aftermath in the Fitzgerald's engine room, twisted metal, scorch marks on the bulkheads, and 3 body bags being loaded onto stretchers. "I asked what you know." Marcus felt his hands begin to tremble, the same tremor that had plagued him for years. "I know that Tommy Reeves didn't cause that explosion by accident. I know that those 3 sailors died because someone gave them the wrong coordinates for the fuel line maintenance. And I know that you covered it up because the real cause would have ended your career." Richardson nodded slowly, as if Marcus had passed some kind of test. Close, but not complete. "The wrong coordinates weren't an accident, Henderson. They were deliberate." The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from the explosion that had changed both their lives. Marcus sank into the chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "Sabotage. Industrial espionage with a body count. Someone in the crew was feeding information to foreign intelligence services, and they needed a way to destroy evidence before we reached Norfolk. The explosion was supposed to damage the computer systems in the server room adjacent to the engine compartment. Instead, it killed 3 good sailors and nearly sank the ship." Richardson pulled out another document, this one bearing official Navy letterhead with security classifications that Marcus had never seen before. "I've spent 32 years investigating who was responsible. The trail led through defense contractors, foreign operatives, and ultimately to someone with access to the most sensitive information aboard the Fitzgerald." "Who?" Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would shatter everything he thought he knew about their time at sea. "Someone who knew about Operation Clean Sweep before it was officially authorized. Someone who had access to the maintenance schedules, the crew rotations, and the communication protocols. Someone who could plant the false information that led to those deaths." Richardson's eyes never left Marcus's face. "Someone who was supposed to be in that engine room at the time of the explosion but called in sick at the last minute." The implication hit Marcus like a second explosion. "You think I was involved?" "I thought so for 32 years. That's why I paid you to stay quiet. Why I had your records altered. Why I made sure your disability claims were denied. I wanted you to suffer the way those 3 sailors suffered." Richardson's voice grew quieter, but more intense. But 3 days ago, right before my heart attack, I received new intelligence that changed everything. Richardson reached for his laptop and turned the screen toward Marcus. It displayed a classified document dated just 4 days earlier, with a header that read, Operation Clean Sweep, Final Assessment, Eyes Only. The real saboteur has been identified. DNA evidence from personal effects found in the wreckage, cross-referenced with personnel files and foreign intelligence databases. The person responsible for those deaths has been living under an assumed identity for the past 3 decades. Richardson's fingers moved across the keyboard, bringing up a photograph that made Marcus's blood run cold. The image showed Sarah Chen, the communications officer who had been transferred immediately after the explosion, but the caption beneath identified her as Liu Weiming, a deep-cover operative for Chinese military intelligence. Chen was the leak, Richardson continued. She fed information to her handlers for months before the explosion. When she realized we were getting close to discovering the breach, she orchestrated the sabotage to destroy the evidence and create chaos during our return to port. The explosion was meant to cover her tracks, not expose them. Marcus stared at the photograph, remembering the woman who had worked beside him for 8 months, who had shared coffee with him during night watches, who had seemed as shocked as anyone when the explosion tore through the ship. But she helped me gather evidence against you. She gave me copies of radio logs, communication records. She gave you exactly what she wanted you to have. Enough to keep you focused on me as the villain. Enough to ensure you'd never look too closely at her role in what happened. Richardson closed the laptop. She's been manipulating both of us for 32 years, Henderson, using your quest for justice to keep the real truth buried. The cardiac monitor beside Richardson's bed began beeping more rapidly as his heart rate increased. He reached for a small device on his bedside table, a panic button that would summon nurses immediately. But here's what she doesn't know, Richardson said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I'm not dying from natural causes, Henderson. Someone has been slowly poisoning me for the past 6 months. And based on the intelligence I received 4 days ago, I have a very good idea who that someone is. The beeping of the cardiac monitor grew more insistent, and Richardson's face had gone pale. But his eyes remained focused and alert as footsteps approached in the hallway outside. Sarah Chen is in this hospital right now, Richardson gasped. She's been here for 3 days, and she's been very interested in my medical care. The footsteps in the hallway stopped directly outside room 847. Marcus watched Richardson's face grow paler as the cardiac monitor's beeping accelerated into an urgent rhythm that would normally bring nurses running. But no one came. The silence stretched between them like a held breath until a soft knock broke the tension. Admiral Richardson, it's Dr. Chen. I need to check your medication levels. Marcus felt the floor seem to shift beneath him. The voice was older, more refined than he remembered, but unmistakably familiar. Sarah Chen, or Liu Weiming, as Richardson had identified her, stood just beyond the door, separated from them by inches of wood and 32 years of deception. Richardson pressed his finger to his lips, then pointed to a closet door on the far side of the room. Marcus moved silently across the floor, his Navy training kicking in, despite the decades that had passed. He slipped inside the closet just as Richardson unlocked the door. Dr. Chen, Richardson said, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious strain, I wasn't expecting you until evening rounds. Through the crack in the closet door, Marcus could see Sarah Chen as she entered the room. She wore a white lab coat with an ID badge, identifying her as Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief of Cardiology. Her black hair was now streaked with silver and pulled back in a professional bun, and wire-rimmed glasses gave her an academic appearance that masked the intelligence operative Marcus now knew her to be. Your heart rate spiked suddenly, she said, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. I was concerned there might be complications from the new medication regimen. What new medication regimen? Richardson asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Chen smiled, the same warm expression Marcus remembered from their time aboard the Fitzgerald. The one I prescribed this morning to help with your arrhythmia. Don't you remember? You seemed a bit confused earlier. She moved to Richardson's IV line, producing a small syringe from her coat pocket. The fluid inside was clear, identical to the saline solution already flowing into his arm. but Richardson's cardiac monitor began beeping even faster. "I remember everything very clearly, Dr. Chen, including Operation Clean Sweep." Chen's hand froze halfway to the IV port. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I'm not sure what you mean, Admiral. You've been under a great deal of stress, and cardiac patients sometimes experience confusion." Liu Wei-ming. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Chen's entire posture changed, her shoulders straightening with military precision that no medical training could instill. When she looked at Richardson again, the pretense of concern had vanished entirely. "How long have you known?" she asked in perfect, unaccented English. 4 days. Right before my heart attack, which I now realize wasn't naturally occurring." Richardson's voice was steady, but Marcus could see sweat beading on his forehead. "DNA evidence from personal effects found in the Fitzgerald's wreckage. Your real fingerprints were on file with Chinese intelligence services." Chen laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. 32 years, and you finally figure it out 4 days before you die. There's a certain poetic justice to that timing." "Why?" Richardson asked. "Why the elaborate charade? Why not just disappear after the explosion?" "Because disappearing would have raised questions. Sarah Chen dying in a car accident or suddenly moving to another country would have eventually led investigators back to Fitzgerald. But Sarah Chen is building a successful medical career, getting married, having children, becoming a pillar of the community." She shrugged. "No one investigates a success story." Chen moved closer to the IV line, the syringe still in her hand. "Besides, I had unfinished business. You and Henderson were the only two people who knew enough about Operation Clean Sweep to potentially piece together the truth. I needed to keep you both close, monitor what you knew, and control the narrative. You've been manipulating Henderson for 3 decades. Poor Marcus. So dedicated to finding justice, so determined to prove you were the villain. It was almost too easy to feed him just enough real evidence to keep him focused on you while missing the bigger picture." Chen's smile was predatory. "He actually thanked me for helping him expose your crimes." From his hiding place, Marcus felt a rage building that he hadn't experienced since the night of the explosion. Every meeting with Chen over the years, every document she'd provided, every conversation about seeking justice, all of it had been a lie designed to keep him from discovering her true identity. "The poisoning," Richardson said. "How long?" 6 months. Small doses of digitalis in your morning coffee. Mimics the symptoms of natural heart disease perfectly. And at your age, no one questions a cardiac event." Chen checked her watch. "Though I must admit, the timing of your heart attack was inconvenient. I was hoping for more. Private setting for our final conversation." She inserted the syringe into the IV port, but didn't yet depress the plunger. "This is concentrated potassium chloride. Your heart will stop within minutes, and the autopsy will show death from cardiac arrest consistent with your existing condition. No one will question the loss of a distinguished admiral who died peacefully in his sleep. Except for Henderson. He knows I was meeting with him about Operation Clean Sweep. When I turn up dead, Henderson will be devastated that his quest for justice led to your death from stress-induced cardiac failure. He'll blame himself, just as he's blamed himself for those 3 sailors for 32 years. Chen's fingers moved toward the syringe plunger. "Guilt is such a powerful weapon, Admiral. It's kept both of you exactly where I needed you." The cardiac monitor's alarm grew more insistent, and Chen glanced toward the door. "Unfortunately, this conversation has taken longer than I anticipated. The nursing staff will be responding to the alarm soon, and I need to be elsewhere when they find you." She began to press the plunger, but Richardson grabbed her wrist with surprising strength for a dying man. "You made one mistake, Lou." "What's that?" "You assumed Henderson was still the same frightened petty officer who followed orders without question." The closet door burst open, and Marcus emerged with Richardson's secure phone in his hand. The device had been recording their entire conversation, transmitting everything to what Marcus could only assume were federal authorities. Chen spun toward him, the syringe still in her grip, but Marcus was already moving. 32 years of guilt and rage propelled him across the room faster than his arthritic joints should have allowed. He tackled Chen to the floor, sending the syringe skittering across the linoleum. She fought with the trained efficiency of a career operative, landing several strikes that would have disabled a civilian. But Marcus had survived combat, survived decades of physical labor, and most importantly, survived 32 years of believing he was responsible for the deaths of 3 innocent sailors. Her training was no match for his fury. Hospital security burst through the door just as Marcus pinned Chen to the floor, followed closely by federal agents who seemed to have been waiting for exactly this moment. As they secured Chen and read her rights, Marcus helped Richardson sit up in his hospital bed. "The antidote is in my medical bag," Chen said quietly as they handcuffed her. She looked older suddenly, deflated by the collapse of her carefully constructed deception. "Third vial from the left. He has maybe 20 minutes before the digitalis causes permanent damage." Quote. One of the federal agents immediately began examining Chen's medical supplies, while another called for a cardiologist. Richardson watched them work with detached professional interest, as if observing a military operation rather than his own medical emergency. "Why?" Marcus asked Chen as they prepared to lead her away. "Why tell us about the antidote?" She looked at him with something that might have been respect, because despite everything, those 3 sailors aboard the Fitzgerald died because of my actions. I've carried that guilt for 32 years too, Henderson. Some debts can't be paid with more death. As the federal agents escorted Chen from the room, Richardson reached for Marcus's hand. His grip was weak, but steady. "Your disability claim will be approved," he said. "Full benefits. Backdated to your original application. It's the least I can do." Marcus nodded, but found he couldn't speak. 32 years of anger, guilt, and searching for justice had ended in a hospital room with the truth finally exposed. The 3 sailors who had died aboard the USS Fitzgerald would never be forgotten again, and the woman responsible for their deaths would face justice at last. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in Arlington National Cemetery, watching as 3 headstones were finally engraved with the truth. Petty Officer James Mitchell, Seaman Robert Torres, and Engineering Specialist David Kim would no longer be remembered as victims of an equipment malfunction. Their new markers read, "Killed in Action, Operation Clean Sweep, Heroes of the USS Fitzgerald." Admiral Richardson stood beside him, no longer needing the wheelchair he'd used during his recovery. The digitalis had been purged from his system, but the doctors warned that his heart would never fully recover from months of systematic poisoning. He'd submitted his retirement papers the day after Chen's arrest, citing medical reasons, though Marcus suspected the real reason was simpler. Some battles leave scars that never heal, even in victory. "The families deserve to know," Richardson said, placing a small American flag beside each headstone. "Mitchell's daughter is 34 now, a teacher in Oregon. She always wondered why her father's death seemed so incomplete. Torres's mother died 5 years ago, still believing her son was careless with machinery. And Kim," Richardson's voice faltered. "Kim's parents moved back to South Korea after his death. They blamed themselves for his decision to join the Navy." Marcus nodded, thinking of his own parents, who had died never knowing why their son came home from his final deployment, haunted by secrets he couldn't share. Chen's trial starts next month. The prosecution says they have enough evidence to put her away for life. "Multiple counts of murder, espionage, conspiracy, and attempted murder of a federal officer," Richardson recited. The FBI found evidence linking her to at least 6 other operations over the past 3 decades. Fitzgerald was just the beginning of her career, not the end. They walked slowly through the cemetery, past rows of white headstones that stretched toward the horizon like fallen dominoes. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of a military funeral, the haunting notes of taps drifting across the hallowed ground. "There's something else," Richardson said as they reached his car. "The Navy is reopening investigations into 17 other incidents from the 1990s where Chen had access to sensitive information. Equipment failures, training accidents, intelligence breaches that were never fully explained. The damage assessment is extensive." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. How many people died because of her? We may never know the full count. Chen was brilliant at making murder look like misfortune, but the counterintelligence teams are tracking patterns now, cross-referencing her assignments with unexplained deaths and security breaches. Richardson unlocked his car, a modest sedan that seemed too ordinary for a man who had once commanded aircraft carriers. She volunteered information during her interrogation, but only about operations that were already compromised. Everything else, she's taking to her grave. As they drove back toward San Diego, Marcus stared out the window at the landscape rushing past. The desert gave way to suburbs, then to the sprawling medical complex where their 32-year nightmare had finally ended. Mercy General Hospital looked different in daylight, less threatening, more like what it actually was, a place where people came to heal. The media is starting to ask questions, Richardson said, navigating through afternoon traffic. A Chinese spy working as a cardiologist for 3 decades, systematically murdering patients while maintaining a sterling reputation? It's the kind of story that destroys faith in institutions. Quote, "Maybe some institutions deserve to have their faith destroyed," Marcus replied. How many people suspected something over the years and stayed quiet because it was easier than asking difficult questions? Richardson was silent for several miles, considering this. The hospital administration is claiming they had no knowledge of her true identity, but the FBI found evidence that Chen had been flagged multiple times for unusual patient mortality rates. The reviews were always inconclusive, the deaths always explainable, but the pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. They pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, the kind of place that served coffee in chipped mugs and knew every customer's usual order. It was a far cry from the officers' clubs and formal dining rooms where Richardson had spent most of his career, but it felt honest in a way that fancy establishments never could. Over hamburgers and coffee, they talked about the future. Marcus had received his disability benefits, along with a substantial settlement from the Navy for the decades of denied claims. He was considering moving closer to his sister in Colorado, maybe buying a small house with a workshop where he could build furniture with his still trembling hands. Richardson had been offered consulting positions with 3 different defense contractors, lucrative opportunities that would have set him up comfortably for retirement. He'd turned them all down. Instead, he was planning to work with veterans advocacy groups, helping other sailors navigate the bureaucracy that had failed Marcus for so many years. "There's a support group in Denver," Richardson said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Veterans dealing with service-related trauma that the system doesn't recognize. PTSD from classified operations, injuries from experimental equipment, health problems from exposure to substances that officially don't exist. Maybe we could help some of them find their own version of justice." Marcus looked across the table at the man he'd hated for 32 years, surprised to find something resembling friendship in the space where anger used to live. "You know, if someone had told me 3 months ago that I'd be having lunch with you, planning to work together." "You'd have punched them in the mouth," Richardson finished with a rare smile. "The irony isn't lost on me either. Chen spent 3 decades manipulating us into hating each other, never realizing she was forging the very partnership that would ultimately destroy her." Their conversation was interrupted by Richardson's phone buzzing with a text message. His face grew serious as he read it. "That's Agent Martinez from the FBI. Chen wants to make a deal. Information about other deep cover operatives in exchange for life in prison instead of the death penalty. Will they take it?" "Probably. The intelligence value is too significant to ignore, even if it means she avoids execution." Richardson put his phone away, his expression troubled. "But it also means she'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison, knowing that she ultimately failed in her mission. For someone like Chen, someone who spent decades building a perfect cover identity, that might be a fate worse than death." As they prepared to leave the diner, Marcus realized that his hands weren't shaking. For the first time in 32 years, the tremor that had plagued him since the explosion aboard the USS Fitzgerald had stopped. The knowledge of the truth, the capture of the real culprit, and the clearing of his own conscience had accomplished what decades of medical treatment couldn't. Outside in the parking lot, they shook hands formally, then embraced with the awkward affection of men who had shared something that couldn't be put into words. Tomorrow they would return to their separate lives, but they would carry with them the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. 6 months later, Marcus received a package at his new home in Colorado. Inside was a photograph of the USS Fitzgerald in her prime, cutting through blue ocean water with her crew standing proud on the deck. On the back, Richardson had written, "For James, Robert, and David, sailors who deserved better than the lies we told about their sacrifice. And for Marcus Henderson, a man who never stopped fighting for the truth." The photograph now sits on Marcus's mantelpiece, beside the medals he'd finally been awarded for his service during Operation Clean Sweep. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes him, he looks at that picture and remembers not the explosion or the cover-up or the years of anger, but the faces of young sailors who believed they were serving something greater than themselves. They had been right to believe. It had just taken 32 years for the truth to catch up with their faith. The trial of Liu Wei-ming, a.k.a. Dr. Sarah Chen, began on a cold Tuesday morning in federal court. Marcus sat in the gallery, watching as the woman who had manipulated his life for 3 decades was led into the courtroom in shackles. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by orange prison clothing and the weight of exposed secrets. Her hair had gone completely gray during her months in custody, and the confident physician's demeanor had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. The prosecution presented a case that read like a spy thriller, complete with forged documents, coded communications, and a body count that stretched across multiple continents. Chen had been recruited by Chinese intelligence while still a medical student. Her entire identity as an American citizen built on fabricated records and eliminated witnesses. The USS Fitzgerald operation had been her first major assignment, but far from her last. Agent Martinez testified about the ongoing investigation, revealing that Chen's intelligence network had infiltrated hospitals, military installations, and government agencies across the country. Her position as a cardiologist had given her access not only to sensitive military personnel, but to their medical records, their psychological profiles, and their vulnerabilities. She had been a perfect spy, trusted, respected, and completely invisible. The defense argued that Chen had been coerced, that her family in China had been threatened, that she was as much a victim as those she had harmed. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed payments from foreign accounts, encrypted communications revealed detailed intelligence reports, and DNA evidence tied her directly to sabotage operations dating back to the 1990s. Marcus testified on the 4th day of the trial, recounting his 32-year odyssey from the explosion aboard the Fitzgerald to the confrontation in Richardson's hospital room. He spoke about the 3 dead sailors, about the guilt that had consumed him, about the years of denied benefits and unanswered questions. When Chen's defense attorney suggested that his testimony was motivated by revenge rather than justice, Marcus looked directly at the defendant. "I don't want revenge," he said quietly. "I want those 3 sailors to be remembered for who they really were, heroes who died in service to their country, not victims of a mechanical failure. I want other veterans to know that their government will eventually listen to the truth, even if it takes decades. And I want to make sure that no one else suffers what I suffered, because someone decided that secrets were more important than justice." Richardson testified via video link from his new home in Virginia, his heart condition making travel difficult. He spoke about the impossible choices faced by military commanders, the weight of classified operations, and the corrosive effect of carrying lies for 32 years. His testimony was measured, professional, and devastating in its clinical recounting of Chen's methodical destruction of lives and careers. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Chen showed no emotion, as the judge sentenced her to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she turned once to look at Marcus, her expression unreadable. He wondered if she felt any genuine remorse for the lives she had destroyed, or if she was simply calculating how her capture might affect other operatives still embedded in American institutions. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected consequences. Congressional hearings were announced to investigate security failures that had allowed Chen to operate undetected for 3 decades. The hospital where she had worked launched an internal investigation that resulted in the resignation of 3 senior administrators and major changes to their background check procedures. The Navy created a new oversight committee to review historical cases where service members had been denied benefits or recognition. Marcus found himself testifying before Congress 6 months after Chen's conviction, sitting at a witness table in a hearing room filled with cameras and reporters. The questions were sharp, the politics obvious, but he answered them honestly. Yes, the system had failed him and countless other veterans. Yes, there were probably other cases like his where the truth had been buried beneath layers of classification and bureaucracy. And yes, something fundamental needed to change in how the military and intelligence services handled accountability. The Veterans Justice Project, as Richardson had named their advocacy group, began receiving dozens of calls from former service members with stories similar to Marcus's. A Marine who had been exposed to experimental chemicals during a classified operation. A Navy SEAL whose training accident had been covered up to protect a contractor. An Air Force pilot whose medical problems from a secret mission had been dismissed as pre-existing conditions. Each case required careful investigation, patient documentation, and persistent pressure on bureaucratic institutions that preferred to keep uncomfortable truths buried. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that many of the veterans they tried to help had given up hope years earlier. But it was also deeply rewarding when they could finally achieve recognition for someone who had been fighting the system alone for decades. The work gave Marcus a purpose he hadn't felt since his Navy days, a sense that his own suffering had meaning if it could prevent others from enduring the same ordeal. Richardson proved to be an invaluable partner. His knowledge of military bureaucracy and his connections within the Pentagon opening doors that would have remained closed to Marcus alone. 2 years after Chen's conviction, they stood together at another cemetery, this time in Texas, watching as the family of engineering specialist David Kim held the military funeral he had never received. Kim's elderly parents had flown in from Seoul, carrying flowers and photographs of their son in his dress uniform. They spoke little English, but their gratitude needed no translation as they embraced Marcus and Richardson with tears streaming down their faces. It was, Marcus thought, what justice actually looked like. Not the dramatic courtroom scenes from movies, but quiet moments of recognition, families finally able to grieve properly, and the knowledge that the truth, however painful, was finally being told. Outside room 847, life in the cardiac wing continued its steady rhythm, but for Marcus Henderson and Admiral Richardson, the long shadow of Operation Cleansweep had finally lifted, replaced by something they'd both thought lost forever: the possibility of peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.